Well, welcome. My name is Carla Durand, and on behalf of the Collegeville Institute for Ecumenical and Cultural Research, I'd like to welcome each of you here to this lecture this afternoon, entitled The Embodiment of Love, the Eucharist as a Mystery to be Celebrated, Believed, and Lived. I have the privilege of introducing this afternoon's presenter, Father Michael Driscoll. Michael is an ordained presbyter for the Diocese of Helena, Montana, and he is also the associate professor at the University of Notre Dame. He teaches in the Department of Theology, as well as serving as the co-director of the Master of Sacred Music program, a program which he created and founded about a decade ago. Michael is currently a resident scholar at Collegeville Institute, and he will be with us on campus through the end of this semester. If Michael's name or his face look familiar to any of you, it may be due to the fact that this is his second Collegeville Institute residency, or it could be that his name or face is familiar due to the fact that in 2003 he was a visiting associate professor of Theology and Liturgy right here at St. John's. Michael's academic credentials are impressive. He received his BA in philosophy from Carroll College in Helena, Montana, his STD in Rome, Italy, his STL in Sacramental Theology from Sant Anselmo, also in Rome, his STD from Catholic Institute in Paris, France, and his PhD from the University of Paris-Sorbonne. Michael has long been active in the National Association of Pastoral Musicians and was on the leadership team of the Catholic Academy for Liturgy. Michael is someone who has a strong grasp, good understanding and overview of the state of liturgical music in the Catholic Church. And he publishes regularly in the field of liturgical studies, including liturgical music. In addition, he is the author of many articles, book chapters, book translations, and monographs. Michael speaks at least 3 languages, and there are probably others of which I'm not aware of, and he is also a talented musician. So please join me in welcoming Michael Driscoll.
So Carla, thanks very much. I got nervous when she said that you might recognize my name and my face because you went to the post office recently. Delighted to be back here. This is great. This is Collegeville is always a wonderful place to be, and especially for the project that I'm working on, about which I'm going to tell you in a little bit. I come from the land of the CSCs, and now I'm in the land of the OSBs. And one time one of the students said, well, don't you have any initials after your name? And I thought for a second, I thought, well, yes, put GVP. And he said, well, what does that stand for? And I said, well, that stands for Garden Variety Priest. And so a day later, he came in with a lapel pin. He says, I think I found the perfect badge for your order. It has a GV on it for Johnny Versace. But I say it stands for Garden Variety. Because that's basically what I am. I'm a diocesan priest for the Helena Diocese, although I've been on loan to Notre Dame for the last 20 years. I went to Notre Dame right after I came to the Collegeville Institute 20 years ago, and I didn't quite make my way back to Montana. But I'm delighted to be here. So the name of the talk is called The Embodiment of Love. I gave it that title because I thought that might be the hook to get some people here. It's like my friend Jean Porter in Moral Theology offers a course in Moral Theology, and she calls it Sex and the Body. But it's really moral theology. We can't tell you that's it. But what I'm going to talk about is the Eucharist in 3 dimensions: as a mystery to be celebrated, a mystery to be believed, and a mystery to be lived. I'd like to build upon the presentation that Charlotte gave last week, where she spoke about the Eucharist at the center of the theology of John Paul II. And so I thought I would like to build upon that. And what I wanted to do is look especially at the last 15 years and how the changes in the liturgy as well as developments in Eucharistic theology have impacted my life and my teaching and my research interests. The last 15 years, we've seen a lot of change, probably more change than we've seen since the Council. We had the third edition of the Roman Missal, which appeared in 2000. In 2004 and 5, it was the year of the Eucharist, proclaimed by John Paul II. And then there was the Synod on the Eucharist. So the promise was I would go all the way up until last night. I checked Zina today to make sure that Francis hadn't said anything overnight on the Eucharist. He said a few things, but it doesn't absolutely pertain to what I'm going to talk about. But I'd like to bring us up to the present moment. So what I'm going to be looking at is the three popes. This is like the three tenors, okay? So we'll have the three popes. So we're talking about the twilight of the papacy of John Paul, the complete papacy of Benedict, and also the beginnings of the papacy of Francis. Luckily, we only really have 2 documents I have to look at with him, so I'm kind of spared. Okay. 1999, that's what I'm going to call the lull before the storm. In 1999, ISIL had finished their project of revamping the Roman sacramentary, the Roman Missal. That was a very lengthy project. Now, I remember when the Missal came out in about 1973, prior to that time, you always knew who Catholics were because you could tell them by their purple hands. These were the days before Xerox machines. And so you'd go to church on Sunday morning and there would be some bootleg translation that was done the night before, and it was run off on a Gestetner machine. And so you'd come home with purple hands. But in about 1973, ISIL came out with a translation that was agreed upon by all of the English-speaking world. Now this is remarkable when you think about it, because the bishops, before they left Rome, the English-speaking bishops, decided that they wanted to have a common translation so that English-speaking Catholics could move around the world and not be stymied by different translations. Now, wasn't it Oscar Wilde who once said, oh, the English and the Brits, or the Americans and the Brits, 2 cultures separated by a common language. But it's really true, isn't it? That we do have variances in the way we speak, nonetheless, we can understand one another. And so ISIL was formed by, the 11 countries for which English was the first language, and I think 9 other countries for which English would be the primary second language, but an important liturgical language. Okay. So, it was done very quickly. Now, the council already made a provision that the vernacular could be used in missionary countries. I think that's what the Constitution on the Liturgy says. So all of those missionary bishops couldn't get home fast enough to Italy, France, Germany, Belgium, United States. Nobody could have seen that we would move so quickly into the vernacular. And of course, the bishops wanted the work done yesterday. So ISIL worked very, very quickly. But they always knew that, okay, we'll revisit this in 15 or 20 years. And then they worked on the other rites. And I have to say that as they progressed through the rites, it seemed that they kind of found their élan. They found their momentum, and the translations got better and better. In the 1980s, ISIL said they would like to begin rethinking about retranslating the Missal. And so at that point, they had 3 consultations of the English-speaking world where they asked for feedback. And after this feedback was brought in, then they started the process of retranslating. Now what they did was that they took the Roman Missal and they divided it into, I think, 8 or 9 segments. And then each year, 1 segment would be ready, and they would send it out for review. Now the American bishops, they wanted to see each segment, and they wanted to vote on it each year, and then they would look at the whole thing at the end. The Canadian bishop says, don't bother with that, just show us the final product. So each conference had their own way of dealing with it. In about year 4 or 5, there was a group of about 10 bishops in the American conference who started asking for all kinds of revisions because they wanted every word translated from the Latin to the English. If they saw 10 words in Latin, they wanted to have 10 words in English. Well, of course, we know that languages don't work like that. The Italians have the expression, they say, traditori tradutori. To translate is to betray. We would always say something always gets lost in translation. But at the Thanksgiving conference, in Washington, the bishops had to sit there for day in and day out and vote on these amendments for all of these emendations that were being requested. So, for example, the word quesumus, we beseech thee, is put into the Latin as a kind of it's kind of courtly language. It's very deferential. Well, every time they saw quesumus, they wanted that translated. Of course, quesumus is one word in Latin. You have to have 3 words in English. I think at the end of the 3 days, the rest of the bishops wanted to take out these 10 bishops and hang them. However, it showed that already we were moving away from what was called dynamic equivalence, more towards formal correspondence. Okay, so that's just kind of the background. So 1999, finally, all of the English-speaking world has signed off on the 9 segments of the sacramentary. It's been approved by the conferences of bishops, as well as liturgical councils and all its input, and it goes to Rome for the recognition. In the same year, an article appeared in America by Rembert Weekland, the then Archbishop of Milwaukee. He is kind of summarizing an earlier article by Francis Mannion that also appeared in America. But what Rembert Weekland does is he kind of sketches out the ecclesiastical landscape. And he talks about reformers, those who are engaged in the reform of the Second Vatican Council, restorationists, who were against the Second Vatican Council and were trying to go back to the 50s. 1850, 1650, but the 50s, okay? But then we have the reform of the reform. As best as I can tell, this is a term that was coined by the then Joseph Ratzinger in his book, The Spirit of the Liturgy. In the same article, Weekland spoke about liturgy wars. And I have to say, when I read that, I kind of winced. But in my heart of hearts, I knew it was true. That the liturgy had become more of a skirmishing ground than a place of celebration. But I also remember when I was in seminary, after finishing the first cycle, I wrote to my bishop and I said, what should I go into for specialization? And my bishop wrote back and he said, well, you've always been involved in music and liturgy. Go into liturgy. And I thought, oh, thank you, Jesus. What a wonderful field to go into. At least he didn't say go into moral theology. Because at that point in time, moral theology was on the hot seat. Joseph Fuchs and company, they were always being investigated. Prior to that, it was the biblical movement. Prior to that, it was the Nouvelle Theologie. And I thought to myself, what could be more beautiful and irenic than the liturgy? Never in a million years would I have thought that the liturgy would become such a neuralgic point. But it has. Okay, a real source of division in certain circles. Let's just kind of review everything that's come out there over the last 15 years. Well, starting in 2000, we have the 3rd edition of the Roman Missal. Is it much different from the 2nd edition or the 1st edition? No, because the liturgy is a very conservative endeavor. It's always reusing prayers. Many of these prayers go back to the 6th, 7th, 8th centuries. So even new prayers that are composed are done in that classical euchological style. So why do we need a 3rd edition? Well, remember, John Paul was Pope for how many years? Over 2 decades. And how many people were canonized under him and beatified? So you had to add all of those in. So we needed a 3rd edition, but it really didn't vary much. The next year, the document came out, Liturgiam Authenticam, which was a rethinking about the principles of translation. Prior to this, we were under a document called Comme le Prévoit. It was penned in French because they thought this is to deal with vernacular translations. We'll put it in a vernacular language. It was this document that said that you can't translate word for word, that you try to capture the genius of a language, and you try to move into the target language, adapting as you need to. But this the new document said, no, we're moving away from dynamic equivalence to formal correspondence. Now again, we can see already there was rumblings about this in the mid-90s, especially in the American scene. Then we have an encyclical of John Paul, Ecclesia de Eucharistia, in 2003, in which he spoke about his own experience, especially traveling around the world his experience having these huge outdoor liturgical gatherings, and he was very laudatory about all of these events. But then he said, but in his travels, he'd also seen some shadows. And he wanted the Congregation for Divine Worship to deal with these shadows. Shadows meaning abuses. Now you can imagine, once this letter came out, the press, we've got so many phone calls saying, what are these shadows? And I said, I don't know, he didn't tell me, we'll have to wait and see. But the number of documents that came out, one after the other, it was really staggering. And of course, some of these documents were embargoed, so you couldn't get them beforehand. But once the document appeared, you get phone calls from the Boston Globe, from New York Times, from, I mean, all over the country asking for an opinion. I had to take so many days off during this decade just to go home and say, can I read the document first before I make up my mind about it? Okay, but that's the way it was. Then we have the Holy Thursday statement of John Paul, Mane Nobiscum Domine, which is kind of a beautiful summary of Catholic Eucharistic theology. The same year, finally, we have the document that was promised from the Congregation of Divine Worship. It was penned by Cardinal Arinze, called Redemptionis Sacramentum. This is the one that spelled out what some of these shadows were. This caused a huge stir, especially in the American Church. I remember shortly thereafter, I was in Italy. I was talking to a couple of Italian liturgists. And I said to them, how is the new document going over? I says, what are you talking about? And I said, oh, in America, everybody has their tail in a knot about it because of, can we use flagons, can we use non-metal cups, all these kinds of things. And that's where this Italian liturgist said, he says, that's the problem with you Americans. You don't know how to receive a papal document well. And I said, what do you mean? He says, you've got to say, oh, we've got a letter from the Papa. We've got a letter from the Papa. But you don't challenge it. I mean, I remember years ago, I was walking with an Italian seminarian, he's now an archbishop, and I made a statement about somebody broke the law. He said, qualcuno ha rotto la legge. And he got very indignant. He said, ma che vuol dire? What do you mean? And I says, oh, he says, excuse me, I made an Anglicism. I've translated right from English into Italian. He says, no, I know what you're trying to say, but he says, you don't realize that we have a whole different impression about law. He says, you have fewer laws, but you have to maintain them all. You can actually break a law. But he says, in our system, we have so many laws that you're always looking for the spirit of the law. And I thought that's interesting. I understood then why we always sent our canon lawyers to Rome to study. Not because we thought that the quality of the education was better, but we wanted them imbued with this non-Anglo-Saxon understanding about law. At the same time, John Paul announced that there would be a Synod of Bishops to deal with the Eucharist. And to help with that, a document came out, an instrument of work, a lineamenta, called Fons et Culmine. This line is taken right out of the Constitution on the Liturgy. And this was gathering in all kinds of concerns from around the world, from all different kinds of dioceses. And that's where I'm going to focus most of my attention today. 2 years later, after the Synod was over, Benedict then penned his post-synodal exhortation called Sacramentum Charitatis. And this will be the basis for my talk. In the same year, it's kind of give with the left and take with the right, we had Summorum Pontificum, allowing for the Tridentine Rite. Okay. So what have we had since then? Well, we have two documents from Francis. One is Lumen Fidei, an encyclical, but it really seems to be the work of Benedict that was unfinished when he resigned, and so Francis picked it up and has brought it forward. But then we have this, the Evangelii Gaudium. Now this is an apostolic exhortation, and it's following the Synod dealing with evangelization, but it's not making direct reference to it. But it seems like, and there's some wonderful things within this document. Okay, so what I want to look at is this particular document called Sacramentum Charitatis, the Sacrament of Charity. Now, this was called by John Paul. But then John Paul died. And so a new pope doesn't have to take the agenda forward. But because Benedict had been involved with this, he decided to go forward with it, and so he actually oversaw the Synod. A friend of mine, Mark Francis, from CTU, was a peritus, and I asked him about it. I said, how did it work? He said, well, all the bishops invited could speak for 7 minutes, and they would come with a prepared statement. And he says it was extremely boring and tedious. They would just repeat the same thing over and over and over. And finally, and the Pope doesn't even attend. They say that he's watching in by way of closed-circuit television, for good reason, because it's really hard going. But there were 2 bishops, I think, from Oceania, or Mauritania, who asked that we would give up the notion of the Eucharist as a meal and return to the idea of Eucharist as a sacrifice. And at that point, they could hear somebody clearing his voice. And in a heavy German accented Italian, Benedict gave them a lesson in theology. He says in Catholic theology, it's never a question of either or. It's usually holding in tension numerous things. And so the Eucharist is both a meal and a sacrifice, and. He spoke 14 minutes. He could do that. He was the Pope. Okay. It's quite a remarkable document. The name of it is interesting because it talked about caritatis. And remember, his first encyclical was also the notion of charity, of agape, agapic love. Although in that, he just makes the classical distinction between eros and agape. This is the book where I think we first hear the expression, the reform of the reform. The title of it harkens back to a German liturgist, Romano Guardini. I hope you're saying to yourself, how does a German get a name like Romano Guardini? Well, his family was actually from Verona, but they had immigrated, and he was very, very important for the liturgical renewal in Germany and outside. So Ratzinger, he was still going by Ratzinger then, and so after he was made Pope, they slapped on Pope Benedict XVI. But that's as early as I can find that we have this expression. Anthony, you might know better than I. I think that's the...
I just Googled it and didn't find anything different either.
Okay. Then we have the principle of multiple attestation. Also, I've looked at this series of writings. Again, these were a collected series of essays and homilies by Ratzinger, and then it was put out by Ignatius Press. So there's quite a bit of material there. Now, when the bishops wrote in from all over the world, they had many, many concerns, but I would say the 3 major concerns would be of a liturgical nature, of a doctrinal nature, and of an ethical nature. Some wanted more reforms in the liturgy, for example, the placement of the Kiss of Peace, among other things. Doctrinal, the whole question about reformulating the doctrine of transubstantiation, or finding different ways to express it. And then finally, there are a lot of people dealing with ethical questions. So for example, how to deal with divorced and remarried Catholics. Can we admit them to the table? As well as how do you deal with world poverty when you're speaking about Eucharist as food? Okay. So these are the 3 primary dimensions. So in a way, I've organized it according to lex orandi, lex credendi, lex vivendi, the classical kind of tag that goes back to Prosper Vaquitator. So the rule of prayer, the liturgical dimension, and how it influences how we believe, the rule of belief, and then how that's lived out, the lex vivendi, the moral dimension. Now, how do you organize it? Well, I have to say that Benedict didn't organize it the same way I'm doing, so just to be clear, I've taken a little bit of liberty. In his, he spoke about the Eucharist, first of all, as a mystery to be believed, then celebrated, then lived. There's another website found recently that speaks about, it's hard to read. Oh yeah, creed, code, cult. So he would put doctrine first, moral second, ethics second, and worship in 3rd place. Instead, what I'm going to do is reverse it and talk about the liturgy first, taking my cue from Schmemann, from Aidan Kavanagh, and from my colleague David Fagerberg, that speak about the liturgy as being the theology prima. And of course, it's incontestable, isn't it? Because we were praying even before we had councils. So the liturgy is a way that we are schooled in our belief. Ultimately, it's got to be put back into an integrated synthesis. So it doesn't really matter really how, in which order, but because ultimately we've got to put it all back into a whole. So I'm going to speak about in the Eucharist, first of all, in its liturgical component, to be celebrated. Then its doctrinal component, to be believed. And then third, lived. So we better get cracking. To do this, I think let's punctuate this with a hymn. This is a hymn that was composed by a priest from Los Angeles, John Schivone. And of course, you know, Los Angeles, I think they say Mass is celebrated in 70 languages every weekend. And they always are trying to take into consideration that Los Angeles is still growing. Other unknown groups are still coming to the city. But of course, the biggest concern is Spanish-speaking, English-speaking. So he wrote this as a bilingual Eucharistic hymn. As a mystery to be celebrated. So we're going to move in this progression of Lex Orandi, the second part, Lex Credendi. I won't stop too long on that. And that'll lead us to the third part, the moral, the ethical part, Lex Agendi. Okay. So in this particular case, I'm taking the liturgy itself as the Theology Prima, as the first place where most people learn about God, is by the celebrating of it. Kavanaugh and Fagerberg are fond to speak about Mrs. Murphy. Mrs. Murphy has never been to a graduate course in theology, but she has lots of understanding about the Eucharist. Where does she get it? She goes to Mass all the time. She's schooled by the liturgy. Okay. And in this, I want to take into consideration the art of celebrating, the Ars Celebrandi. And I have to say, this is why I've come to Collegeville right now. My project is dealing with just this, the art of celebration. In that, I've got to juggle in the whole question about how do we have an artistic celebration, but at the same time, we obey the council to say that it is a right of all the baptized to fully participate in the liturgy, the participatio actuosa. This term has been fought over a lot recently, people trying to redefine it, but we'll look at it in this context. So why the Ars Celebrandi? Well, one of the American bishops who was at the Synod of Bishops is Wilton Gregory. He's from Chicago originally. He's the Archbishop of Atlanta. He also holds an earned doctorate from San Anselmo in liturgical studies. So in his little 7-minute speech, he addressed the Ars Celebrandi. He said, "The priest skilled in the Ars Celebrandi will offer the prayers from a heart so conformed to the heart of Christians that by the way he says the divine words, he must convey to the faithful the living presence of Christ. Okay. So there was, again, I think a growing awareness about the proper celebration of the sacraments, especially the Eucharist. And that makes such a big difference. Here is my hero. His name is Albert Rouet. He's the retired Bishop of Poitiers in France. He wrote a lovely little book that was translated from French into English, I believe at the Collegeville Institute, by Paul Philibert. It's called Liturgy in the Arts. In it, he starts with a very bold statement. He says, the liturgy is an art that uses other arts. And art and liturgy, when they join forces, express transcendence. That was his opening line. When I read that, I couldn't put the book down, because it really resonated with my own experience. I remember my first year in seminary, I went to my spiritual director once, and I told him that I thought maybe I had more spiritual experiences in the concert hall than I had in the chapel. And he told me not to worry about it, I'd get over it. Well, see, I think he thought I was confessing, but I was really professing. But I think, 30 years later, I wouldn't be so categorical. You can have spiritual experiences everywhere. But the arts are such a powerful force. And that many people do have the experience of the transcendent by way of the arts. I think the American bishops understood this in their document called, what was the initial one? Liturgy Music and Catholic Worship, 1982. And it was redone by Anthony sat on that committee. And in 2008, the new document is called Sing to the Lord. There were some things in that document that I was really hanging my hat on when I started the program in sacred music at Notre Dame. I used music and Catholic worship as my Magna Carta. And I was so afraid what was going to happen, whether some of these things would be excised out. They weren't. This was one of the ones. It was modified a little bit. It used to read, faith grows when it is well expressed in celebration. Good celebrations foster and nourish faith. Poor celebrations can weaken and even destroy it. Mm-hmm. But maybe that was a bit too bold, a bit too bold. But they didn't lose the gist of it. But I think that's really important, that we understand that people really have a need for good worship. In cities, people will shop around. They will go where their spiritual needs, their liturgical needs will be met. The problem, however, what constitutes good liturgy? Usually, in these gatherings, you say good liturgy and people nod their head, and bad liturgy and people nod their head. But what constitutes it? What are the criteria? For some people, it's the style of music. They want a contemporary style. For other people, they want polyphony. For other people, they want concerted masses. So music will play a big role there. For other people, homiletic style. Curiously, there's a parish in Chicago, Old St. Pat's, and it was dying. It's next to the freeway there. The area was becoming very unpopulated. And the pastor, Jack Wall, came in and he says, I am going to bring this parish back with good music and good preaching and a strong sense of hospitality. Well, now when you go to it on Sundays, you have to carry a shoehorn to get in. People come from all over the city of Chicago and farther away. So he really did capture that. But what does constitute good liturgy? For some people, they want it all in and out 20 minutes. So, I think that this is one of the reasons I wanted to come here, was to work a little bit on some of the principles as to what constitutes good worship, drawn from the documents, but also from philosophy and theology of aesthetics. Now, this comes from the post-synodal declaration of Benedict. It says, to celebrate the liturgy means to do the action or perform the sign in such a way that its full meaning and impact shine forth in clear and compelling fashion. Since liturgical signs are vehicles of communication and instruments of faith, they must be simple and comprehensible. Since they are directed to human beings, they must be humanly attractive. They must be meaningful and appealing to the body of worshipers, or they will fail to stir up faith. So there's a strong statement, isn't it, about how beauty is attractive. And by way of beauty, we can be brought into the realm of the transcendent. Okay. How do I get back? Okay. A friend of mine is Julia Upton. She is a former provost for St. John's University in New York. And her mother was a dancer, and Julia herself was very artistic. And she always makes a point that we have to make sure that the arts that we use actually support the mystery that we are proclaiming. That if we use something which is inferior, we trivialize the mystery. And so the example I'm going to use with you is from Frank Birch Brown. We're going to sing Psalm 22, 23, but we're going to do it to Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. Are you ready? Here we go. I know the Lord's my shepherd, I will never need a thing. He gives me grass that's greenest, takes me to the coolest spring. When I am sad, he cheers me. When I'm happy, he makes me good. Wherever he will lead me, I will follow as I should. Though I walk through valley, dark as dead and sin, nothing there can frighten me. With your staff, you're my true friend. People can see I'm fed well. I could hardly ask for more. I'm going to stay forever with the one who's really Lord. Now, don't get me wrong, this is my bad example. Sometimes I've done this and somebody will come up and say, can I have the words for that for my children's liturgy? He says, no, please. Frank Birch Brown wrote a great book called Good Taste, Bad Taste, Christian Taste. But he just shows how some pieces of music are just unredeemable, no matter how much you would try. There's a Magnificat that we sometimes sing at St. Mary's, and it's to an old Scottish hymn. And I can sing the words, the Magnificat, outwardly, but in my inner ear, I'm here, I will go, lassie, go, to collect wild mountain thyme. There's just no way I can get that out of my head. So we need forms, artistic forms, that actually support the mystery. So my project is really dealing with liturgical aesthetics. And the main point is that an excellent, careful, well-planned, and well-executed liturgy is already a first step in educating people. It's a kind of first-level, ground-level mystagogy. Kathleen Hughes used to teach in Chicago. Wrote a book called Saying Amen, in which she speaks about how the mystagogical method can be applied to all of church life, not just to initiation. It's really important for all the sacraments, but also for life in general. Mystagogy is a little bit like a three-legged stool. It's an experiential way of knowing things. You get to know things from the inside out. The main point of mystagogy is you first of all have the experience. Then you have a moment of reflection, and then a moment of sharing. But the mystagogical method sometimes gets short-circuited because we don't give sufficient time for reflection. This is what Benedict would call sacred silence, kind of fill the void with words. And secondly, a chance to share. Recognizing that in the liturgy, we don't express everything only discursively, but also symbolically, imaginatively. And so it really is a challenge, I think, to be able to see that the expression we have is done at multi-levels. So here I'd like to speak about ritual as an art. And that rituals are an art only to the degree that they are enacted. Is this music? No, it's just dots on a page. It's not music till you sing it. In the same way, the liturgy isn't the book. The book is a support for the liturgy, but the liturgy is not the book. I say that because a lot of people, I think, confuse the reform of the books with the liturgical reform. The reform of the books is just a first step. It's now how we deal with the books, how we enact them, that we make the liturgy into this embodied experience. In a way, liturgy is like opera sacra. It's very ambitious. It uses all of these various arts to create ritual. It's like drama, that it reenacts salvation history. It's like music, that it has moments of sound and moments of silence, moments of tension, moments of relaxation. It's like dance, because it moves. It moves in a procession from point A to point B. It moves washing hands, it moves eating, it moves anointing. So it needs to be orchestrated. It's like poetry. Poetry is not discursive, but it's imaginative. So if you think about like the two sides of the brain, liturgy is trying to engage the whole person, not just one aspect. So here I'm talking about an aesthetic mode of celebration. It's not liturgy and the arts. The liturgy doesn't become artful because it uses the other arts, but the liturgy is an art unto itself. And it's an integral aesthetic form in itself. It resembles the other arts. We can take our cues from the other arts. We recognize that it has its own rules, its own way of being. Saying that, however, is a danger. Now, sometimes I'll speak about the performative aspect of liturgy. That liturgy is only liturgy when it's being performed, but when you use the word performance, right away people think, oh, it's a spectator sport. Here, the agent is the celebrating assembly. And so how do we bring that home? How do we protect the principle of full conscious and active participation and not allow things to drift back to simply spectating? There's an interesting book there was a series of articles that came out in America, and it was then edited by James Martin. And they'd asked liturgists from around the country to contribute. And then afterwards he put it together. So he's making the claim that this is how to celebrate good liturgy. Look at the table of contents. He didn't begin with musicians or preachers. He says the good liturgy happens when the assembly recognizes that it is their job to make good liturgy happen. Then he goes down to speak about the presider of the word, the Eucharist, deacon, lector, parish liturgy committee. Finally, in seventh place, music ministry. I mean, I think it's important because so often, so much is placed on the shoulders of the musicians and on the preacher. You say, well, no, maybe we're creating a kind of a passivity. Okay. So one of the places where I've looked is a couple statements. One was from Paul VI at the close of the council, a letter to artists. And the other one is this letter to the artists written by John Paul, which I really like because he was an artist himself, a playwright and an actor. And I thought he has the heart and the soul of an artist. In it, he speaks about beauty, goodness, and truth, and that these are all interrelated. And he quotes this line from this Polish poet, Cyprian Norway. He says, "Beauty is to enthuse us for work, and work is to raise us up." And he starts with the very idea that musicians and artists, they share in the very creative energy of God, bringing something out of nothing to a certain degree. Okay. Now, do you remember back to that meeting, famous meeting in Chicago? This was the consultation for the reworking of music in Catholic worship. The room was equally divided, very, very tense. You had half that were really staking their claim for Gregorian chant. The Gregorian chant has pride of place. And the other half, mostly composers and publishers, who were saying, well, yes, it has pride of place, but the Holy Spirit didn't go on vacation. We can do other forms of music in the meantime. Well, finally, there was this one woman who stood up and she made this plea about how music is so important because it prettifies the liturgy. And she used an example. I didn't even understand it at the time. She talked about as a child, she was given a doll named Pitiful Pearl. Do you remember her? Do you remember this?
I don't remember the doll. I remember the.
Do you remember this? Yeah. I just scratched my head. Well, apparently, Pitiful Pearl came with her own retinue of things, so that you had to transform Pitiful Pearl into Pretty Pearl. And that's what music is. The function of music in worship was to prettify. I thought, that doesn't square with what John Paul had to say. Because the whole idea of Collegeville is we need art forms that speak truth. The trouble with the pretty is, you put pretty wallpaper on the walls, or you put a lot of artwork, and then after a while you don't even see it. It just becomes like wallpaper. But sometimes what we need is the beautiful, which shocks us into action. And that's what I think John Paul was getting at with the term Collegeville. I like to say it because I can. It reminds me of John Keats. He says, beauty is truth, truth beauty. That is all you know on earth and all you need to know. And so it's this search for the beautiful. So my project is to try to bring the beauty, the notion of the beautiful, into the other transcendentals as a way of knowing God and a way of building faith. And the example I want to use is from Picasso's Guernica, which was the Spanish Civil War. Peace itself could not go back to Spain until after the monarchy was restored. I was lucky enough to see it in New York. Before you actually got to see the entire piece, you got to see little pieces that he was working on. And so it was you could kind of grasp that. But then you walk into this large room, and the piece itself is, it's equally that size and taller. Wow. And it was stunning. It's not pretty by any stretch of the imagination, but it's absolutely beautiful in that it speaks to us about the horrors of war and fraternal strife. So Benedict picks up on this in his post-synodal exhortation. He says, like a test of Christian revelation, the liturgy is inherently linked to beauty. It is the veritatis splendor. The liturgy is a radiant expression of the Paschal mystery in which Christ draws us to himself and calls us to communion. But then he goes on to say, this is no mere aestheticism, and this is the part I'm struggling with now. How can you have an aesthetics of liturgy and not simply devolve into a mere aestheticism, and what does that mean? But the concrete way in which the truth of God's love in Christ encounters us, attracts us, delights us, enabling us to emerge from ourselves and drawing us towards our true vocation, which is love. So I said I would try to bring us up to date. This is something I found in Evangelii Gaudium of Francis, which I think is a powerful statement. He speaks about the via pulchritudinis, the way of beauty. Proclaiming Christ means showing that to believe in and to follow him is not only something right and true, but also something beautiful, capable of filling life with a new splendor and profound joy, even in the midst of difficulties. Every expression of true beauty can thus be acknowledged as a path leading to an encounter with the Lord Jesus. So I find some continuity here. But then again, he goes on and again gives us kind of a warning, a proviso about kind of aestheticism. This has nothing to do with fostering an aesthetic relativism, which would downplay the inseparable bond between truth, goodness, and beauty. This is my line I'm going to hang my hat on. Truth, goodness, and beauty. How he brings those together with unity. Okay, let me move on then. Let's sing. Is it warm in here, or is it just me?
It's like 2 weeks ago.
Yeah. Thank you.
Amen, el cuerpo de Cristo. Amen, la sangre del Señor. Eating your body, drinking your blood, we become what we receive. Amen. 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 Lord, you make us one body and one spirit. Amen. And tu cuerpo, Señor, un pueblo santo. Amen. Amen. El cuerpo de Cristo. Amen. La sangre del Señor. Eating your body
this text from Cyril of Jerusalem. And it is that beautiful text to say, as you approach the table of the Lord, place your left hand in your right, as to create a throne upon which the King of Glory will be enthroned. And the fact that as you're singing this song and receiving communion, there is a strong ecclesial sense. So the second part, what I want to speak about, the Eucharist as a mystery to be believed, and this won't be as long as the first part. Okay? So what I'm looking at is a little bit the way we teach Eucharist today. Kind of taking our cue from Anton Baumstark, we really study Eucharist according to Eucharistic texts. And we look at texts, anaphora, Eucharistic prayers, East and West, ancient and modern. And we try to see what remains constant in all of these ways of praying. How does the way we pray actually influence how we believe? And one of the things we find is that all the prayers are prayed in the first person plural. So I ask my students, is this like the Queen of England who says, "We are not amused"? Or is it a real plural? I say, oh, it sounds like a real plural. And I say, as it speaks about the people as the circumstantes, those standing around the altar, isn't that really talking about all of us praying together, all of us celebrating? Okay, so we can agree upon that. We all recognize also that it's addressed to the Father, and usually the message is simple. Thank you, as the word Eucharist means. And the initiative comes from God. It's interesting, the word liturgia, a word that I went to the Baltimore Catechism. Liturgy doesn't even appear one time in the Baltimore Catechism. And so for the last 50 years, we've become imbued with it, speaking about all kinds of liturgies. Well, at first, to try to explain what it meant, we said, well, it's taken from the Greek, laus ergon. Laus, people, ergon, work. So we said, oh, liturgy means the work of the people. But I think in more recent years, there's been more careful attention to that to say, it's not just what we're doing, it's also what God is doing. It's not so much the work of the people, but it's the public work. The public work of God, of God's people, and our response. The initiative is always from the side of God. So we're not going to place all the emphasis on what we are doing. So it's both, it's an opus Dei, a work of God, and an opus hominum, the work of the people. In it, we give thanks to God, especially for Jesus, for the incarnation. And the liturgy itself becomes the embodiment. It's the extension of the incarnation. If God can take on human form in Christ, God continues to take on human form in our sacramental life, in our church. And then we look especially to the Holy Spirit. And much more attention is given to, I wish Killian was here, to the pneumatological dimension. The whole dimension of the role of the Holy Spirit. Something which is very apparent, I think, more in the East than in the West. We're coming to a greater appreciation of that. Okay. The other thing is that it's a prayer of the church. We say that the priest prays in persona Christi. It's Christi Ecclesiale. He's praying on behalf of the church, the body of Christ. And in it, there's a strong eschatological component. I mean, we say it very nicely. Let us proclaim the mystery of faith. When? And drink this cup right now. In the past. In the future, yeah. The one I used to like to use, it was a little bit clearer, was Christ has died, Christ has risen. But we gave that up. Why? Because it was heretical. No. Why don't we say that any longer? Well, because in all of the other ones, we're always addressing Christ, aren't we? Through your cross and resurrection. When we eat this bread and drink this cup, we proclaim your death, O Lord. In that one, we don't talk to Christ, we speak about Christ. Christ has died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again. But it's perfect as a kind of a formulation. Has died, past. Is risen, not has risen, is risen, present. Will come again in the future. I think the early Christians understood this so well that they stand between the past and the future in the present moment. They would sing about it, Maranatha, an Aramaic word. If you divide it in one place, it's a statement of fact. The Lord has come. If you divide it elsewhere, it's the Lord, come Lord, imperative. Okay, and it holds it all together. So my students will play a game. I'll say, I'm going to sing it now for you. You tell me which way I mean it. Past or the future. Maranatha. Okay, how many think the past? How many think the future?
The second version, I think.
The second, okay, the future. How many think it's a trick question? Because you're saying it all. That's great. It's this delightful ambiguity. You state everything all at once. Okay. Good. Okay. Let's sing. Before Chris has to take off.
Amen, el cuerpo de Cristo. Amen, la sangre del Señor. Eating your body, drinking your blood, we become what we receive. Amen. Amen.
Amen. We find you when we serve the poor and lowly. Amen. A ti mismo servimos en los pobres. Amen.
Amen, el cuerpo de Cristo. Amen, la sangre del Señor. Eating your body, drinking your blood, we become what we receive. Amen. Amen.
So in this last part, I want to speak about the Eucharist as a mystery to be lived, so the moral dimension. Charlotte last week referenced Virgil Michael. And one of my colleagues at Notre Dame, Michael Baxter, was kind of rediscovering Virgil Michael. Virgil Michael, we always pigeonhole, we always think, oh, he's the liturgist, and Dorothy Day is the social reformer. But we find that Virgil Michael has a lot of writings about morality, about how the liturgy shapes us to live. So I'm glad that we're kind of breaking out of those kinds of compartmentalizations. But we want to see the moral dimension of the Eucharist, how the Eucharist schools us for action. Here's from Evangelii Gaudium. The Eucharist, although it is the fullness of sacramental life, is not a prize for the perfect, but a powerful medicine and a nourishment for the weak. Now, at the Synod of the Bishops, they took their cue from the actual word Mass itself. We speak about the Missal, the Mass, and as we know, it comes from the verb mito mittere missus. It's the past participle, to be sent. And it's not really a Christian formula originally. It was a juridical formula taken over by the Christians. So we say, ite missa est, ite, go, she is sent. I guess it's feminine. Well, who's the she? Ecclesia? Church, yeah. It's ambiguous, okay? But the early Christians gave this new meaning, and that term missus is also the basis for the word missio, mission, and commissio, commission. And so we find in the Eucharist, it's curious that we talk about the Mass by the very ending words, the go get out of here. We call it by that, by the dismissal. Well, if we call it by that, it must be important. That dismissal must have a very important place for us. And that we recognize that the intention is, the Mass is a little bit like an oasis. We're taken in, we're refreshed by the Word, and by the Word, ultimately to be sent out. So at the Synod of Bishops, they said the Eucharist then is the pulsating heart of mission. It's the authentic source and its only end. Now for many of the bishops, especially in the Southern Hemisphere, their concerns are dealing with how do you speak to people about Eucharistic food when they don't have regular food? And unless you take care of those kinds of questions, Eucharist as a meal doesn't make any sense at all. And so they wrote, regrettably the scandal of hunger continues to endure. Indeed, it has worsened in recent years, given that more than 1 billion people live in misery. In this regard, some statistics from society are worth considering, particularly relating to the question of hunger. This cannot be overlooked in the Church's evangelization mission in the world. This is the part when you were speaking last week, Charlotte. This is the part I was thinking of in terms of how John Paul's social mission gets taken forward, especially at the Synod. So the statistics. As of then, 842 million were undernourished worldwide, 789 million in the developing countries, especially in sub-Sahara, Southern Hemisphere. So Benedict picks up on this and he does a reflection on the Our Father. He says, "Give us this day our daily bread," obliges us to do everything possible in cooperation with international, state, and private institutions to end or at least reduce the scandal of hunger and malnutrition. Then I like this line very much. "The Christian lady formed at the school of the Eucharist." The Eucharist schools us, it forms us. "We are called to assume our specific political and social responsibilities." So there are social implications of the Eucharist, that it's a symbolic activity with untapped levels of meaning. Go ahead. And in a sense, the Eucharist is kind of countercultural. It strengthens the bond between life and mission. In a culture of death, the Eucharist is a culture of life. In an atmosphere of individual and societal selfishness, the Eucharist reaffirms self-giving. Where there is hatred and terrorism, Eucharist places love. In response to scientific positivism, Eucharist proclaims mystery. In desperate times, Eucharist is a sign of hope. That's worth a poster.
Yeah.
Okay. So we talk about the Eucharist then as having transformative possibilities. And here I'd like to focus a little bit on the question of the role of the Holy Spirit. We speak about this as an epiclesis. The Holy Spirit is called down. But as we look at the prayers, we can see that there's also what seems to be a double epiclesis. That we ask that the Spirit changes bread and wine, but we also ask the Holy Spirit to change us. Like we sang, that we become what we receive. That we become bread broken, we become wine poured out. And that this is the goal of this double epiclesis, sometimes a split epiclesis. It's also the reason why we have to be very insistent and maybe use this as an occasion to catechize. For example, when we teach Eucharistic ministers, they're not to say, "Tim, the body of Christ." But to say, "Body of Christ." Why? Not to say, "This is the body of Christ." In the same way, we had to unlearn in the liturgy where we said, "This is the word of the Lord." And we said, no, that's not what the words say. It just says the word of the Lord because it's not limited to this. It's a living word in our midst. So in the same way, when the Eucharistic minister just says, "Body of Christ," and the person says, "Amen," they're saying amen to multiple levels. They believe Christ is present in the elements, they believe Christ is present in them, and they believe that Christ is present in this ecclesial body. Okay. St. Augustine says it beautifully. "So then the Eucharist is our daily bread, but let us in such wise receive it that we may not be refreshed in our bodies only, but in our souls. For the virtue which is apprehended there is unity, that gathered together into his body and made his members, we may become what we receive." Okay. So here we're talking about real transformation of real people into the body of Christ. So the Lineamenta picks up on this for the Synod. It says, "The dismissal of Mass is an invitation to mission." And then Benedict picks up on that. He says, "These few words, 'Go in peace,' ite missa est," succinctly express the missionary activity of the Church. The people of God might be helped to understand more clearly this essential dimension of the Church's life, taking the dismissal as the starting point. Okay. Just for a couple minutes, I'd like to reflect with you on the closing rites. The general instruction gives us a very spare outline. It says brief announcements if necessary. Now most people say that's not necessary. We'll come back to that. The priest greets and blesses, which on certain days and occasions is enriched and expressed in the prayer over the people or another more solemn formula. The dismissal of the people by the deacon or the priest, so that each may go out to do good works, praising and blessing God. And finally, the priest kisses the altar, the priest and the deacon, followed by a profound bow to the altar and by the other ministers in the procession. What's missing here?
Closing hymn.
Closing hymn, yeah. Why? Well, Anthony, you can tell us from history.
We forgot? No.
Because it was never part of our tradition, was it? Wouldn't it be nice if the dismissal was a true dismissal? Instead we say, go, the Mass is ended, but before you go pick up your hymnal and sing 3 verses, or 2, just to get me down the aisle. Now I've oftentimes I give talks and priests will say, oh, I have such trouble with my people because they never stay for the closing song. I say, it's your fault. You told them it was over. They just took you at your word. I mean, maybe I'm a liturgical fundamentalist, but I think that you should say what you mean and mean what you say. If it's over, it's over. But maybe you can anticipate some music here, some kind of a song of thanksgiving. But when you say it's over, it's over. But what about the announcements? Instead of just doing a long list of announcements, I wonder about in a parish if they were to carefully craft a couple of them that show how they are living out the mission of Christ. It becomes a way of not just, I mean, because people can read the other stuff in the bulletin, but this becomes a powerful way to say, this is how this church is living out their mission. Finally, the kissing of the altar. When I was directing the cathedral choir in Helena, I had my ringers, my non-Catholic singers. And I had one woman who had sang with me for several years, and she asked me one day, she said, why at the beginning and at the end of the Mass does the priest bump his head on the altar? And I thought about it for a second, so I put myself where she was seated, and that's what it looked like. Well, she had this elaborate theology about head bumping. And I said, no. I said, the altar is the symbol of Christ. He's kissing Christ, and I told her about from the Syrian liturgy, altar of God, I know not if I should see you again. Beautiful prayer, almost a poem that the priest prays to the altar. So she had to go back and revise her liturgical theology. Okay. But it's interesting, it's very, very spare, but at the same time, there are places where it could be enhanced. When Cardinal Daniels came to Notre Dame several years back for the anniversary of the Synod for Liturgy, he commented that the opening rites seem to be so protracted, but the closing rites are too abbreviated. And that he thought it was almost like a lack of respect that, you've gone to communion and you're simply pushed out the door right away. And shouldn't there be more time for some silence? And maybe a time that, in terms of these blessings, that we actually bless certain groups of people, like Eucharistic ministers. I mean, oftentimes it's invisible. The Eucharistic minister comes up and they take out their pick and they say, give me 2. No one sees it. And yet, it's such a beautiful ministry. And to bless them and to say, go out with our love, bring our love to the person who is sick or shut in, tell them that we're concerned about them. But there's all kinds of ministries, liturgical as well as non-liturgical, that could be part of this commissioning rite. Okay. So, this is the quote I was telling you about last time. From Mater Nobiscum Domine. He says, the Eucharist not only provides the interior strength needed for this mission, but it is also in some sense its plan. For the Eucharist is a mode of being which passes from Jesus into each Christian, through whose testimony it is meant to spread throughout society and culture. And I'm going to give the last word to our current pontiff. He says, the Church urgently needs the deep breath of prayer, and to my great joy, groups devoted to prayer and intercession, prayer for reading of God's Word, and the perpetual adoration of the Eucharist are growing at every level of ecclesial life. Even so, and here he's quoting John Paul's apostolic letter, he says, we must reject the temptation to offer a privatized and individualistic spirituality which ill accords with the demands of charity, to say nothing of the implications of the Incarnation. This is a strong statement. There is always a risk that some moments of prayer can become an excuse for not offering one's life in mission. A privatized lifestyle can lead Christians to take refuge in some false forms of spirituality. Words to live by. Happy Valentine's Day.
Thank you, Michael, for this spirited presentation. We have time for a few questions or comments.
Denunciations. Done.
I was thinking about some of your earlier statements about how different parts of the liturgy give you that moment of the expressing the worship. one moment for me in the new translation that is just jarring, and I know lots of lay people seem to...
Louder, please,
But
Con.
as well, is the response that's partly a biblical quotation, you know, Lord,
I'm not ready to receive you.
but on, and thy soul shall be healed. Now that speaks Platonic dualism to me in spades. And is there a way that through translation, or you know, what's going on there? Can you say something more about that and what?
Yeah,
would take
that's a
part?
hard text for me as well.
Yeah.
And we have to realize that that was a text we used until 1973,
Oh, I know.
wasn't it? So we've gone back to that. It does make it kind of a biblical reference, but that, like you say, that my soul shall be healed. You say, well, what about you? That's not the biblical reference. Isn't it the healing of Jairus' daughter?
No, it's the
Centurion.
The centurion servant, yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
But you have three stories that are very similar, where an adult speaks on behalf of the child, whether it be a son, a daughter, or a servant, and they're healed because of their faith. They're healed in body, not just their soul. But I think we'll find is that there will be other translations in the future. We probably won't live to see it, but for the time being, yeah. But that's the one, I call it the mumble prayer. In many communities, that's where I hear more mumbling that goes on. So there doesn't seem to be a general consensus as to what to say. Wilfred.
Is it a time to abandon transubstantiation?
As a term?
Yeah.
That's what Skillebeck certainly argued, and for the reason that we no longer have an adequate metaphysic to understand the idea of substance versus accident. And for most people, when they hear substance, they think physics, they think physical body. And so if the term itself is misleading people, bringing it to the opposite what the church is actually proclaiming, then should we hang our hat on the term, or should we figure out a new way to express it? It's curious that you should ask that, because Peter Steinfeld did he writes for the New York Times, as religious editor, and he did a poll or canvassing of Catholics. And he determined that American Catholics no longer believed in real presence. And of course, the bishops read this, and that's why they wanted us to kneel from after the Holy Holy all the way to the thing. So anyway, Peter Steinfeld was challenged by sociologists. They said, if your instrument is flawed, your results will be flawed. And they said, in this case, in that case, in the other case, you're asking leading questions. And so Peter Steinfeld had the grace to retract his article, but the damage is already done. I mean, I don't think the real presence is in jeopardy. I mean, I think American Catholics are fine with it, but in terms of how to express it. Right? But of course, some people really hang their hat on transubstantiation because it's 7 syllables. It's 7 syllables. Skillebeck, he proposed 2 things. He said transfinalization and transsignification. And I'm thinking, why are we caught up on multisyllabic words?
But Pope Francis says anything that science can prove will not contradict faith. And chemists can prove that the consecrated host is bread without any trouble.
Yeah, I remember at the turn of the 20th century, there was a Jesuit in Rome named Salvaggi, and he wanted to put the host on an electronic microscope and say the words to see if he could see the change. He had to be taken off the podium right away because he totally misunderstood. But in a way, he's representative, because I don't think we think metaphysically; we think physically, and so that's what he was aiming. There's another Gerald.
I appreciated how you developed your understanding of aesthetics. At first, when you started talking about what's good liturgy, I was worried. Then when you put, the assembly first with James Martin's outline in front. Behind this is some of my, I think, most moving initial experiences of the Mass as an observer on my way to becoming Catholic were some very kind of ordinary Masses in in Central America, you know, where I just had this sense of, you know, here is a group of, you know, maybe out in a village, and a group of peasants, and the priest, I'm going along with the priest, and they only have Mass every few months, or once in El Salvador in the conflicted area, you know, and it's just an ordinary Mass, but there's so much going on that they're even gathered together. And I guess I had this sense of almost kind of awe that, you know, saying the Mass, the structure of the Mass is the same around the world. The global church is represented here in this motley group of people. The priest may or may not be saying that, that's not what I remember. It may have been a marvelous homily, or not. You know, it was just that gathered, all of that kind
all
of coming
together.
together.
Yeah.
But being made available to, in a way that wasn't, you know, wasn't great music. It's probably off tune, you know. But God's presence in these ordinary people. So whatever you do with what is good liturgy, I hope you can somehow capture that sense that.
Well, it's probably not a one size fits all. That's the thing.
What's that?
It's not a one size fits all.
Yeah, right.
Kathleen Norris had a great comment on this at her Madaleva lecture. It was called the Quotidian Mysteries. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And it's a great reference. She says, here is a, is she Methodist or Presbyterian?
Presbyterian.
Okay, in Linden, South Dakota, and going to the Catholic Church and seeing this wonderful mystery take place at the altar. And she says, and 2 minutes later, the priest is washing the dishes. She says, that was truly beautiful. But to see it that way, you know, to see God in the ordinary. And it sounds like that was your experience in South America. But it was extraordinary to the degree that it was very ordinary. John?
I would just like to personally applaud you as a fellow Montanan. And I simply want to say that you lift my heart greatly in this cause. I think it is vital to our faith, and you make me proud.
Well, thanks. Well, thanks so much for coming, everybody. This is great.